There is nothing better than hearing a steam engine barking as it works. It's loud, it's proud, and quite a sight to see, especially if it's a cold morning. All that steam makes quite a dramatic backdrop. But there is no way better than the sight of Lickey, the steepest adhesion standard gauge line in the UK. Now, inclines are one of the biggest challenges an engine can face, and for drivers facing a gradient, there's two things that they must consider if they hope to tackle it. One, how much power that they give to the engine to get over the hill, and two, the weight of the train behind it. Now, bear with me as I'm about to get a little scientific, and I apologise if I babble here, but I'll do the best I can. In honesty, I'm about as good at physics as Trump is in telling the truth. So, in most railways in the UK, they work on the principle of adhesion. Now, basically put, the contact between the railhead and the wheel creates friction, or in this case, traction. As the metal railhead and the wheel meet, there is just enough friction to cause a weak grip on the rail. This grip allows the wheel to turn. Now, too much adhesion, for example, if the railhead is rusted or worn, this will cause more friction and the engine will have to work harder to move. If there's not enough adhesion, such as the railhead covered in oil or leaves for example, this will lessen the friction and cause the engine to slip, sometimes with nasty results. Adhesion also has to take into the factor of weight. If there's not enough driving force at the front of the weight of the train, then the train can lose traction and slip. Now, you see this a lot when engines are pulling out of stations with long trains. They may have a wheel slip or two, even though they are perfectly capable of pulling the loads behind them. When the steam was mainline, station pilots were more commonplace and were used to help combat this wheel slip by pushing the train from behind to help the larger engines start. Now, this is great on the flat, but on an incline, the friction of an adhesion railway, it is the same as a gradient. However, other factors do come into play, one of which is gravity. Gravity acts as a balancer and keeps everything anchored to the ground. On an incline, the balance shifts and gravity becomes unbalanced as the object ascends, as it has no parallel force other than the friction from the engine's wheels. If the force of gravity is greater than the traction that the engine is creating, then this will cause the engine to lose adhesion, and in true cartoon style, the engine will stop, or in some cases, roll backwards, and it's a basic explanation of this equation. So with all the above in mind, and the average engine's power also in the mind's eye, when the Birmingham and Gloucester Railway proposed a new line between Gloucester and Birmingham, the railway had a dilemma. Birmingham sat on average 150 metres above sea level, but Gloucester sits in a valley that's just a few metres above sea level. So between them, there's several sharp inclines. Now, the railway was given two options. Option 1, to make a twisting, winding line that bypassed every incline, or as engineer William Mawson proposed, make the line climb up in one part near the Lickey Hills, have the engine climb a 2-mile, 1 in 37 incline, but because of its geography, it was not possible for a viaduct or a cutting or a tunnel. Well, they were the only options. Amazingly, despite reservations from Brunel, who had earlier proposed a longer route, and Stephenson, in 1836 Parliament authorised the building of the railway. Within 4 years the railway had reached the base of the incline. Luckily, the small town of Bromsgrove lay nearby, and the start of the incline, knowing that the adhesion problems, the small town was perfect to station engines that could be used as bankers. But even then, the use of those was still even the use of those, there were still concerns that the engines of the time would simply be inadequate for this hill. Mawson had a solution. He had heard of the American-built Norris locomotives and knew that they were distinctly more powerful than their UK counterparts. In 1836, the Norris brothers that owned the company proved to all that their engines had the motive power to indeed climb hills, and with a decent load behind it to boot. They carried a 4-2-0 wheel arrangement and proved perfect for the line. In truth, the railway had little choice, as many UK manufacturers were unwilling to supply their engines for this incline. The Norris engines were dominant on the line, and 26 were purchased, and they would run the line for 16 years, either with their own trains or would act as bankers for other locomotives. After proving that modern engines could indeed scale the summit of the incline, this bolstered manufacturers to produce engines that could utilise this incline. The tank engine named Great Britain emerged from Bromsgrove Works and was designed specifically for the incline. It was the most powerful locomotive of the time and could boast hauling upwards of 135 tons up the incline at a steady 8 to 10 miles an hour. Other bankers began to emerge, including the rebuilt Jones and Potts long boiler engines and the Class 1Fs. 1911 was an age of splendour, refinement and power. But on the incline, Great Britain was showing its age, and newer technology meant that things could be more refined. The Midlands Railway's chief mechanical engineer, Henry Fowler, wanted to oversee the design of a new type of engine that had the power of 3 locomotives combined. After many years of tweaking, the Midland gave the green light for just 1 locomotive to be built. The war between 1914 and 1918 put things on a temporary hold, as Fowler's role in the MOD took him away from Derby. It was up to designer James Anderson to take up the reins and finalise the design. He had years of experience and was no stranger to challenges. He oversaw the last of the construction. What emerged in 1919 could only be described as a beast. Nicknamed Big Bertha, the Midland Railway spared no expense. It had an insane 10 driving wheels, and you could easily crawl into its massive twin outside cylinders and still have room to spare. She sported 4 cylinders, but only had 2 sets of piston valves. Because of the sheer size of the outer cylinders, there was little room under the smokebox for the piston valves to fit the 2 inner cylinders. So rather than have 4 pistons, the engines used crossover steam ports. The outer pistons, by the use of these ports, would serve the inner cylinders as well. It was not the most effective method for steam flow, however this would have only mattered if Bertha was going to travel at great speed, something this engine clearly was not designed for. The outer cylinders were also set on an angle and were driven by the centre set of driving wheels. A superheated boiler and huge tender holding up to 4 tons of coal and 2,050 gallons of water gave it the fuel, and finally a huge headlight fitted to the front helped drivers see when estimating the distance between them and the back of the waiting train. Carrying the number 2290, Bertha would be the most powerful engine the Midland Railway would ever produce. She would become famous on the incline. Not only would the banker help push wayward engines over the hill, but she acted as additional security to ensure that all the load got over safely, especially freights. Reports of trains breaking away from gradients were far too real, and without continuous braking, especially on freight, some drivers were unaware until they got to the next signal and found that their tails and their guards were missing. But it wasn't just Bertha that resided at Bromsgrove. Other bankers were stationed there too. The load of each train was sent forward from the signal box at Cheltenham. From there it was calculated which banker or bankers would be required for the load using a load diagram. If the weather was against them, then the driver themselves can order additional bankers. When the train approached the Stoke signal box, the driver, with the use of his whistle, can select how many bankers would be required. He would whistle once to say that a banker was needed, and then whistle again for the number. The bankers would be readied as the train passed them. Because of her size, Bertha was counted as 2 locomotives. The train would stop and the bankers would line up buffer to buffer behind it, ready to push. Once over, the bankers would ease off past Blackwell Station. If there were multiple bankers, then the bankers would be given themselves ample room between each other before going back down the line. It was estimated that Big Bertha travelled over 800,000 miles, with over 99% of it going backwards and forwards over that 2-mile stretch. She was a dedicated engine and a fan favourite among train spotters. When British Rail took over, Bertha was renumbered to 58100, and the railway was keen to run trials to see if advancements in engineering could see the retirement of standing banking engines. But after several trials, the bankers would have to be retained. It was just not possible for engines to get up the incline without assistance. But despite her service, British Rail replaced Bertha with other engines. In many ways, it felt wrong, but it made sense economically. Bertha was a one-of-a-kind engine needing one-of-a-kind parts. By replacing her with standard engines, although they would not have the same power, it was deemed more cost-effective overall. But what to do with Bertha? In the end, after several battles to preserve her, her cylinder block was retained, as well as her headlight, but she was sent for scrap in 1957. The line was serviced and Bertha's headlamp was placed upon its replacement, 9F92079, a 210-0 tender locomotive and one of the more larger engines that British Rail would make. She would go on to see the end of steam and was scrapped shortly after. Now it was the turn of the diesels to bank the Lickey Incline, except a new rule change meant that the trains were banked regardless of what they were pulling. The new Class 37 would excel in this environment. Eventually they would replace the modular process that the steam engines had. By the mid-1980s, two Class 37s fused together permanently were now used for all banking uses regardless of weight. But as each new diesel was produced, the coupled 37s were being used less and less. When the HSTs were introduced in the mid-80s, as there was two power cars, the bankers for passenger uses were no longer required. Freight, though, was another story. In the mid-1980s, freight could still traverse the line unfitted, this being that they had no continuous brakes throughout the train. The train still had a real risk of breaking and losing their tails, so banking engines were still required. The demise of this practice would reduce the bankers. But the Lickey Incline still has stabled locomotives, even to this day, and yes, they are still used for banking. Today, purpose-built Class 66s are used for the duty. There are 5 Class 66s used. They are mostly used for either freight or, on occasion, the odd charter train. The line has since been electrified and passenger trains today have little trouble crossing the incline. But for some, though, there is nothing better than seeing a freight train charge the hill with the Class 66s pushing behind. It's a great sight to see, and while the era of seeing steam helping steam up the incline is at an end, it's still a formidable climb for many engines.